during this very challenging time where we had to be forced to be separate from our friends and our colleagues, I was really grateful for this Anchor app, which has allowed me to continue the podcast after almost 1 year of working on it. It's free. You simply go to anchor.fm and download the app. And there you'll find all the tools that you need to record and edit your podcast, as well as to invite people onto your podcast through the app. Anchor also distributes the podcast for you on Apple, Spotify, and many other platforms. You have absolutely nothing to do except to record your podcast. If you have an ad like this, you can also make money. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. I would recommend it for anyone who wants to get their voice out there, has something to contribute. Go for it. Anchor.fm is where you go to download the free app and to get started. Good luck with your podcast. Welcome to Season 4 of the Bees and Honey podcast. Today, on Episode 1, you will hear from Vadis Turner about her new exhibition, Cups and Grids, at Geary on the Bowery in New York City. I hope you enjoy this.
Hello?
Yes, how are you?
We did it. I'm well. How are you?
Good, yeah. We managed to figure out the world of long distance conversations.
Yes, one small accomplishment for us. We'll see what else we can cover today.
I'm really grateful for the little things, as you can imagine, these days, because if I concentrate on the big things, I'm liable to be suicidal.
I totally hear you. I sort of feel like the expectations are high, the stakes are high, and the expectations are low. You know,
well said. The stakes are high for sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I didn't see you much in New York, but I was very happy to see you wearing red, which is, I think, a very strong color for now. You know, it's life affirming as far as I'm concerned. Tell me how the exhibition went. Like, how did you come up with this exhibition, Cups and Grids?
Well, first of all, thank you for coming by the show on the day that it opened. I know that, it's all bets are off these days. So I was so grateful that you came by and asked me to come back to the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I certainly want to talk about the work and the concept and everything that I made, because I'm super proud of this show. But I also just want to say, in terms of like logistics, I mean, not producing a show, that was a pleasure to make during a pandemic, because I frankly needed the deadline, for my soul. I needed to do the work. And when the pandemic struck, Geary, understandably, was like, we don't know what September will look like. We don't know if this is going to be digital or partially on view or fully on view, but, chances are it's going to be digital. And I was like, I will be ready in September, because this feels really good at this particular time in the world and in my life, to really tuck into my work and sink into it. I mean, It always feels good to do that, but especially in the greater context of what was going on. And I was like, I'll be ready in September, but I think we all thought it was going to be digital. And it was to my, great delight that they wanted to move forward and have the show happen in real life. But also, I had started making huge works, not even thinking about the floor plan, because when it's digital, the floor plan doesn't really matter, right?
Yeah.
You can do whatever you want. As much as you want, as big as you want. So I really overdid it in terms of production, and they were so great to help me edit it down to the most essential pieces. But to get the work there, the logistics alone were so
challenging.
They were amazing, for lack of a better word. I had to come 2 weeks early to New York to quarantine so that I could show up, safely to install my show and have appointments on the first 2 days of the show being open. And for me to quarantine for 2 weeks means I had to bring my eldest son, who's doing remote learning, to New York with me and homeschool him from a Brooklyn apartment. So anyway, it was just I don't know. It was a wonderful and wild and strange confluence of events that brought the show into fruition.
Mm-hmm.
And
then,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I saw some things like the big red grid in the back.
Mm-hmm.
It reminded me of the last show you did, Monoliths. I know the concept is different, but how different is it from the last work? I mean, it looks different, but in terms of your process and your brain working, how did it develop from that last group of works?
Right. Well, and I'm glad you brought that piece up first, because the large sort of stuffed, swollen red grid that's on sort of the main wall in the back when you walk in is really the first piece that I resolved for this show. And it was definitely conceived on the wings of my last body of work, Megaliths, which was presented last year at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs. And so, yeah, that definitely had a megalith and monolithic, energy to it, but different that it is more of a clear grid, and it had these new elements put in the interior of the grid. So that was made, that was the first piece that I resolved for this show. And this body of work, sort of speaking more broadly about it, unlike megaliths, was much more intuitive. It was really like following a scent and really like learning to, trust my instincts and have the confidence to see them through. Megaliths, like previous bodies of work that I had made, was sort of based on a package of clear research, based on like Neolithic gender roles and Neolithic lifestyles, and when man started to erect stone circles and megalithic structures, and then in turn when people started to settle and traditional gender roles took place. So I based the last body of work on this research, which I could expound upon. And then this one was different. This was about me really doing what I felt needed to be brought into the world, and I didn't have to have the language all worked out for me beforehand. The language sort of came in tandem with the rhythm of the work. And in developing this body of work, it really started back in the spring when I was following my own interests. I mean, not knowing if I could bring them into the studio, but I was sort of rediscovering my excitement and my passion for brutalist architecture. And I was also studying the behavior and the biology of moths. Now, I was doing it for personal reasons, of course, hoping that I could bring it into the studio and make this awesome body of work from it. But, in reading about these two things, they were both interesting, but so separate from each other. I couldn't find the overlap or the cross section. And I don't know that there is one, or I couldn't find one. And then, I started fumbling around in the studio in the spring. And, when I start every new body of work, I try to be very patient with myself about embracing bad ideas and just letting, just enjoying the process of these bad ideas and bad drawings and just the fumbling and the clumsiness that, is every, I think, good starting point. But it wasn't going that well. And then right when the pandemic began, I sort of had this aha moment that I forget every time I start new work. But I realized that I have to insert myself into the work and my perspective on whatever position is in this time in my life. I have to insert that into the work so that it has fuel, that I am part of it. So I don't know why it's always hard for me to get to that place, but I became the cross section of these two topics. I became the overlay because, like many of us, I was trapped. I sort of, like the moth, had the ability to fly, but like the brutalist architecture, was weighted down to the ground and confined, right? So the work became about exploring these contrasts that the topic of moths and the examples of brutalist architecture brought to the table. So I was exploring the relationship between weight and flight, vulnerability and austerity, and systems and unfurlings, and letting the work just come from that place and lean in different directions as needed.
Yeah, well, what I liked about it, besides it being decidedly different from the last body of work, is that it had this sort of organic feel. I mean, the brutalist stuff for sure, but also this nature. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, but for example, that the one that's the witch, I mean, I know it deals with some domestic stuff as
Yeah.
well, but you could totally see it as a structure in nature related to moths, like their home or their when they're in this form before they become moths, like the pupa.
Totally. I'm smiling and
Yeah.
nodding over here. Yes, yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. But why cups and grids? Yeah, I mean, I can see the forms there, but how does that relate to the architecture and the moths and stuff like that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I remember when I posted the title on Instagram, you commented, you were like, oh, it's like the tarot, there's this sort of
Right.
like elemental energy here. And I actually really would love for you to talk about why you responded that way to those two words, just because I don't know the answer to that, but I love that you said that. Would you mind actually before I
Well,
answer?
I mean, only because they are very strong images, and the tarot images have specific meanings. Each one has a different connotation and is about another aspect of life. And in some ways, these images that you have in the work can also become this a shortcut to certain aspects of life in the real world,
Yeah.
like something like
No,
that.
I love that you said that, and I think that really resonates. How I came to cups and grids was, I guess I love things that have. I love the legacy of these two forms, right? I mean, how humans, when humans in early evolution, the creation of the vessel really changed our quality of life, and also the organization of the grid very much still defines how we live. So
Right.
there's this legacy and certainly art and just in our culture that these two forms carry with them or are potentially burdened with in some ways. And on the idea of a burden, both of these forms have a lot of like rules and expectations. Like a cup is supposed to hold something. It's supposed to be
Yes.
rounded. It's supposed to work. It's supposed to look a certain way. And a grid, same thing. It comes with these rules and expectations. And I guess, maybe the older I get, I'm like really resistant to rules and expectations these days. And I sort of, and with the greater context of my work, I want the materials and now the cups and the grids to misbehave in some way. I want to use the materials or the structure of a grid or the expectations of a cup in a way that like betrays their intended function. So what happens when a vessel can't hold anything? Or when a vessel is made of like something soft? Or what happens when a grid looks like a grid, but it's limp? So it's like a soft linear system as opposed to something rigid with predictable horizontals and verticals. So, I like the expectations and the history and the legacy and sort of the burdens they bring with them. And when I bring in my process and my materials, I want to mess with that.
Yes, yes. Well, I like that answer as well because it leads to my next question, which is how your work has changed or how it's reflecting the times in America now, where the expectations are being altered in some ways forcefully
Yeah.
by the protagonists.
That's such a good question to sort of think about how that relates to the microcosm of my studio and how what's happening in the microcosm relates to the greater sort of sphere. And I wish we had more time to talk about it. But I guess let me think about it. I mean, I guess in general, I like change. I mean, I like to pivot in my work, and I like a lot. I want to give myself a lot of freedom to have the work, yeah, shapeshift from one year to the next. And it
Yes.
changes a lot, and I don't know if some people would say too much, but it all makes sense to me, each evolution of the work. But I guess I really like the change. I mean, this is a totally ridiculous way to make a living, and like if you don't, it is, I mean, and if you don't make it hard, and if you don't have to
Right.
problem solve and stimulate, and I just don't want to know what it's supposed to, I don't want to know what it's going to look like. I want to have to figure it
Yes,
out, and
yes.
there's a real ebb and flow of control there. So anyway, I like the change just because because that's how I'm learning in my own practice. I mean, how that reflects to what's going on. I mean, I think, the majority of this work was made during the pandemic, right? And I feel like I sort of spoke to that earlier, but also the pandemic is simultaneously happening with this, crisis of leadership, for lack of a better, more general
Yeah,
description in our
yeah,
country.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
live in a red
Yes.
state, right? So I live like
Yeah,
to some
yeah.
degree in the heart of it. So there's a lot of like, I have a lot of exposure to opinions that are in opposition to my own, and it's
Right.
threatening and it's uncomfortable, you know. And I'm also raising children in that environment too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the work reflects like there's a real severity and there's a real harshness, and that the contrasts sort of that I experience in my local culture are also not president,
Mm-hmm.
present,
Also present.
in the
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
microcosm of my studio with the contrasts
Mm-hmm.
I'm presenting in these new works.
Yeah, I mean, and I keep looking at them, even when there are different materials. I guess some are wood, some are cloth, some are this woolen yarn or stuff, and even there's a leather piece, I
Mm-hmm.
think. All these grids and the way they're all tied up with this suggest this sort of bondage in our society. Like we have to get ourselves unwrapped or untied or on whatever from these issues.
100%. And I feel that,
Yeah.
yeah, there is this tangling, right? That I, and
Mm-hmm.
there's this tangling in
Mm-hmm.
the work, there's this tangling sort of like, you know, in the
Mm-hmm.
community. But I also feel like just from my practice, like I don't need to make sense of everything. I don't need to like erase
No,
my
no.
fingerprint. And with this body of work, I really
Right.
embrace the mess. Like I like the mess, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I like the unruliness of some of these
Yes.
pieces, and to let that be
Yeah.
their strength and not their weakness is something
Mm-hmm.
that I'm excited about in the work, and it's something I'm excited about as a woman, and you know, like as a mom, that the you know, you can simultaneously give off energy and be unglued, you know. And maybe that's like the better way to do it, instead of always trying to categorize something and have things make sense and add up and fit together.
Right. Right.
And we don't live in a world that looks like that anyway.
That's true. So I know you just launched this new exhibition, but what do you think you're going to be working on in the next few months, or how do you see things panning out in the next few months for us
Well,
all?
for us all, I cannot answer. I mean, I hope there is an overthrow and a huge change. I hope there are even more shifts ahead. You know, I certainly hope that's the case. I guess, you know, for my own practice, you know, it's funny. I always give myself permission to take a break after I finish a large body of work, but it's so hard because that's also
Mm-hmm.
like you turning off the faucet at a cold stop when you're like really in the flow and you really know what to
Right.
do next, and one thing is leading to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really want to stop, but I'm definitely going to slow down
Mm-hmm.
and enjoy. You know, I feel like sometimes after a show there's sort of this postpartum, you know, of like what
It's
next,
true.
or oh god, the lull and the
Yeah.
dull and the
Yeah.
silence. And I feel just such a
Yeah.
great relief that it actually happened, given the current climate and all the, yeah, and all
Situation.
the hurdles that the Geary and I had to um get through to make it. So I really feel a sense of calm and relief, but that is in sharp contrast to what I feel about what's going on outside the studio. So I will focus
Yeah.
my efforts
Yeah.
on making calls for Biden.
Well, I think it's interesting, but I follow this one guru, and she likes to say, in order to make the greater change outside, let's just focus on what we are
Right.
doing. It's each person does what, so, you're hunkering down in your world and doing your work. If everyone just focused and did their piece, the greater good would be taken care of like that.
May it start with these words
Yeah.
and go out into
Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Well said.
But you mentioned that you had edited the exhibition because of the space. So there must be some other work you created that we didn't see in the show,
Oh
for
my God, I have
example.
so much work. I mean, I have so
Yeah.
much
Well,
work.
why don't you guys do a supplemental exhibition online nonetheless? Just because it's in the gallery doesn't mean the online aspect has to just disappear.
Brilliant. No,
It's not that
you're
hard to,
absolutely
yeah.
right. Yeah, I know. It's like
Yeah.
Instagram is a show, an exhibition 365 days a year with like absolutely no limits. But
Yeah.
I also want to say this, you know, working with Poppy and Dolly and Brooke at Geary, I mean, they really
Mm-hmm.
extended the show into their own office space. So for anyone listening, you know, the show
Mm.
is up until
Mm-hmm.
October 31st. And if the door is
Mm-hmm.
shut, they're super happy to create, you know, to socially distance while people walk around. And there are 1, 2, 4 or 5 additional works in the office area. So they were really nice to extend it into the backspace. And I actually like the mess of the work with all the stuff that's happening in the office. Like there's a really nice, I don't know, there's a nice contrast and a nice harmony equally there too. So anyway, but yes, we have many more pictures we can put online. I don't know. I went for broke during the pandemic in the studio.
Right.
I really turned on the midnight oil, which I'm grateful I got to do. I mean, I guess I'm just so grateful.
Yeah.
I'm grateful I get to do this, and that, I don't know, it all really happened. It's all really out there.
And that other people are able to enjoy it as well and somehow get some sustenance to get through these times.
Yeah, it's definitely got some grit. You know, this show has definitely got some grit. It's not about, you know, I hope it's sort of fierce and charged, more so than just aesthetically pleasing. I hope it doesn't look like I have it all worked out in the best way.
No, well, that's what I like about it. It still has that unfinished quality. I mean, all the domestic stuff like the knitting and stuff, you still see it, but there's also the harshness of some of the works.
And it's really because I always use materials that are kind of sourced from the domestic sphere, but this time I actually went into the foundation of the home. So I brought insulation, you know, kind of reversed its position on the wall. It's like usually hidden as a silencer and it becomes the object. I pulled out, you know, I'm working with concrete for the first time and partnering the concrete with bed sheets. So something that's soft and malleable with something that's obviously very rough and tough and rigid. And so, yeah, it was really, it was like an excavation.
Yes. Well, good luck with the show and enjoy the rest of the weekend. And hopefully I'll see you soon. When I go back, I will ask them to access the office space so I can see the other works that are in there.
Well, please do. And thank you for going back. Thank you for inviting me back to your podcast. And I wish you all good things. And I'm grateful to know you.
Yeah. Take care. Big kiss to your boys.
And to your boy. All the best.
Okay. Take care. Bye, Vadis. Thank you for joining us on this first episode of season 4. Hopefully we'll be having you back here in the next few weeks on another podcast, and stay tuned for more information about my upcoming project. Have a great week.